Good afternoon again. I just want to welcome everybody back to our Conversations on a Prophet is Not Known in Her Town, Conversations on Visionary Women. Thanks for being with us. I'm going to hand it off now to Kathleen, Maas, Weigert.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the third and final panel. I have to say a special shout out to the women religious who might be in participation of this great event. And especially to the BVMs, because I am a BVM associate. So I just want to put a plug in for all of us. And then thank Judith for telling us that she is a Benedictine Oblate. How wonderful. What a great world we're in. So my name is Kathleen Maas Weigert, and as of July 1st, I am now a professor emerita. Emerita. I like that term. Isn't that fun? Such a fun word. Here at Loyola University Chicago, where I taught sociology and in the program of Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies. So one technical note, we'll be using the Q&A box on your screens for questions, comments, and look forward to them. How can I not start this by saying thank you to the Hank Center for their initiating this project, for the team that has made it possible, including the students whose name I don't know, so I can't mention them. But it's such an important topic, and I would argue not just for our church, but for our country and our world. So I thank them all. These are such challenging times. So many ways it can become overwhelming. But we're stopping to take some time to think about what might be different about CST. So I have to say, first of all, many of us use CST to stand for three things, not just Catholic social teachings, the magisterium, the official language, but also Catholic social thought. All of us who think and write about it, what it means, how it might be expanded, and of course, Catholic social tradition, the people who have lived this and contributed to it in everyday life. So CST, I am a Trinitarian, and I like having all three terms for the CST. There's so much good in CST, and we could have a wonderful time just conversing about how inspiring it has been to so many of us. But there are also challenges in it, not the least of which is to think about how it was very much out of the Western world. And there's a globe that we are now much more aware of, and our brothers and sisters around the globe have their ideas about what should be included or not included. When we look around and try to name the reality, as some of the other panels and our keynotes suggested last night, what wonderful meaty stuff we've been given. It's important. One of the ways sometimes we talk about it in CST is to say we have to read the signs of the times. Where are we? What's being called forth? And I would say that there really is a basic question. It can be framed in words, but the idea is whose voices are listened to, whose lived realities are taken in CST. One of the questions underneath that is who's got the power, and how do each of us manifest our own power in thinking about how we want to contribute to this vibrant tradition. So I am delighted to be the convener of this third panel, which is called Conversation with Colleagues. Let's Rethink CST. And our speakers are going to help us tackle this critical area of our common life. The four of us have decided to do a somewhat different format. The panelists will be talking about ideas they are percolating. This isn't a formal address. We're just lucky enough to hear them think out loud with us. Secondly, each speaker will introduce the next person so that there'll be a kind of a round robin or an Olympic pass off of the wonderful hoochie-jiggy, as Mike said to me at another point. So we're going to make this flow, we hope, in the organic way we've been talking about it since we started thinking of it. Then what's my role? My role will be to gently remind them when it's close to their time that they have to finish, because we have others that we want to have speak. After the three of them have had a chance to share some of their percolating thoughts, the four of us will have a conversation. Maybe there's a question that somebody really posed that someone else wants to think about, or maybe there's a comment that seems to be elicited by some of the comments and someone would like to mention that. We'll do that for a bit, and then we will open this up to the rest of you, and we look forward to having your thoughts, your comments as we proceed to try to rethink CST. So with that, I welcome you on behalf of the panel, and I turn the mic over to Catherine, who's going to introduce our first speaker. Catherine.
Thank you, Kathleen. And I'm just really thrilled to introduce our first speaker to all of you. I first met Christiana Zenner about 5 years ago, and the first word that came to mind for me to describe her is just brilliant. It's just amazing and brilliant. Christiana is Associate Professor of Theology, Science, and Ethics at Fordham University in New York City. Her book, Just Water, Theological Ethics and Freshwater Crises, is now in its 2nd edition. She's also co-authored 2 additional scholarly books and is the author of more than a dozen peer-reviewed articles on Laudato Si, theology and science, ecological values, freshwater, and the ecological turn in Catholic social thought. Her most important professional work, she says, in this pandemic moment is as chair for undergraduate studies in theology at Fordham College at Lincoln Center, where she interfaces with faculty and students in this new world, the pandemic hybrid learning amidst ongoing systemic racism and civic occlusions. She describes herself as a single mom with white privilege and joint custody who loves swing dancing, witty puns, and is a master of the 4-minute voicemail to girlfriends who are all parenting and working in this pandemic moment. So Christiana, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. It's been so lovely to have these preliminary conversations with colleagues who are acquaintances and friends, because especially in a strange and disorienting time like this, the opportunity to come together, in some cases after 5 years, in some cases across geographies, under the kind of cognitive load that so many of us are carrying, and the logistical infrastructural load is really a salve. It's a kind of balm. It's very healing. So it is wonderful to be on this panel and in conversation today. Thank you to the Hank Center for, on behalf of all of us, for allowing us to create our own format and have this be a conversation. And to everyone who's sitting with us and thinking and chatting with us today, we really look forward to hearing from you. I'm going to speak in about 5 movements, each of them succinct, owing to time limits, because as I said to my undergraduates today, a professor is like a gas. It can expand to fill the time allotted in terms of speaking. So the first comment I want to make is on myself and Catholic social teaching. And then I have a series of 4 reflections that are anchored by quotes from women whose work has been very important to me. So I call myself an accidental theologian because I did not intend to, nor really for a long time, understand myself as a theologian. I still don't. I'm more like an accidental apophatic theologian who came into this inductively because of my interest in ethics, religious ethics, especially Catholic social teaching, as one mode of drawing on the sciences and social sciences and, at best, forms of lived experience to reflect in more nuanced ways on the complicated realities that beset the contemporary world. Now, obviously, I've written a lot about the problems in Catholic social teaching, as well as some of the positive aspects. But a lot of my work more recently has been on fresh water and on the Catholic Church's turn to extolling indigenous ecological value systems, the promise and the perils of that approach when uttered by a patriarchal institution with a long history of authoritarian epistemologies. So that's me and CST in the present day. And I tried for a while to make this a more kind of formulaic, here are my several points about Catholic social teaching and where it needs to go, but life is just not like that. And so my thoughts today are not so much like waves that leave a precise tracing of an outline on the shore. They're a lot more like the swells that become those waves that are informed by deep currents, where one idea and history blends into one another and are indistinct until they take a particular form subsequently. So I'm going to speak in several more oceanic kinds of swells. I, of course, love the water metaphors. You can't get away from them. Each links CST in a certain way with my own experience and thoughts, and is an homage of sorts, as I mentioned, to someone who's informed my life and work. Stated a little bit differently, this is a project of citational ethics, and I take that term from Sarah Ahmed, who is the author of a fabulous book called Living a Feminist Life, which everyone should read, if at all possible, where she writes, page 17, citation is how we acknowledge our debt to those who came before, those who helped us find our way when the way was obscured because we deviated from the paths we were told to follow. Her project is particular to citing feminists of color who seek to dismantle whiteness and structures of oppression, obviously incredibly important goal. So my first moment of citational ethics and homage is, of course, my dissertation mentor, Margaret Farley. Margaret was once described by a colleague as someone who was so consistent and smooth that when she spoke, you had to listen. And it was only later that you realized the profundity of what she was saying and the skill with which she said it to her particular audience. Now, the thing that I want to draw out from her is the intellectual habit, all too rare today on Twitter and other grand podiums, of giving each thinker their due and challenging them robustly when it matters. I learned this from Margaret in her class on History of Christian Theological Ethics. My interpretation is to have integrity with the way that ideas have been received and also what they occlude, what kinds of power and privilege give rise to their articulation in certain forms. And when the refusal by a certain author, by a certain thinker, by a certain leader, when the refusal to expand that discourse to recognize one's own limited perspective becomes culpable. That's the point at which integrity dissolves. I think there are a number of points in CST that we could talk about with this, but the one that is closest to my heart and that I find troublesome indeed is the official Vatican magisterium's apparent inability to cite communities of women religious in terms of their lived practice, experience, the kinds of commitments they've long taken on in communities to embody Catholic theology and Catholic social teaching. And so while I celebrate in Laudato Si the diversification of footnotes, truly a thing a scholar pays attention to, diversification of footnotes, it is indicative. Follow the footnotes and you will see what is informing the thought. And there are huge omissions there. So this is a point of critique. The second person whose insights I want to lift up is my beloved friend and colleague, Professor Siobhan Garrigan, formerly of Yale Divinity School, where I met her, now the Loyola Chair of Catholic Theology at Trinity College, Dublin, and the head of the School of Religion. I have two insights from her. The first is a strategic interlocutive skill, and that she is the person who taught me to say, when being effectively theologically mansplained to, not to say, no, that's wrong, that's infuriating, you're not hearing me, but instead to say, yes, and with that and, after the yes, completely dismantle the argument. So, you know, yes, very nice, pat, pat, and also all of this. It is a strategy that makes me laugh because we can affirm the humanity in interlocutors. We can affirm that there is truth, as Margaret Farley indicated, in each perspective, and yet, and more needs to be said. She is also, as someone of Irish origin, someone who's taught me an enormous amount about decoloniality and about the ways in which colonial mentalities persist among religious congregations and in social and cultural life in ways that I was not attuned to see before we met. The next thing that she taught me is, this is as a friend and as a fellow female human, surviving is not the same thing as thriving. Surviving is not the same as thriving. This mantra is one that is shared by a number of thinkers, including a number of womanist thinkers whom I admire. And it is also something that I think in this pandemic moment is important to attune to on levels civic, political, and also very personal. So I'd encourage us to ask ourselves, What are our habits and strategies of pursuing thriving amidst a time when so many basic forms of survival are at stake for so many? And again, I mean this on multiple levels of scale. The third person whom I'd like to cite in this citational ethics homage is Professor Emily Towns, now Dean of Vanderbilt Divinity School, who in her writings and in her teaching demonstrates that hermeneutics of suspicion are essential when engaging institutions and especially authority structures, particularly when it comes to matters of gender and race. And that is true on, in individual levels as well as institutional forms, but it doesn't mean that the deconstructive impulse is enough. So what is it that we are trying to say and build differently? Here, Dr. Towns, as a womanist theoethicist, is someone who tries very much to model the constructive impulse after the incredible deconstruction that she does in a number of works, including her 2007 book, Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil. And I will also say about Dr. Towns that her book, Breaking the Fine Rain of Death, was one of the first theological ethical texts to look at the ways that race and racism and gender intersect disproportionately with regard to the health of Black women, which is, again, sadly, very salient right now. I suppose it has never stopped being. It's now just more visible. And I think that with regard to Catholic social teaching, the lessons are easily translatable there in terms of hermeneutics of suspicion and also articulating how we would do it better. Whose voices need to be included? Whose sufferings and what does that suffering look like? And as Kathleen noted at the beginning of this, who gets to decide whose voices have authority and universality? Whose suffering and experience is overlooked? What is that relationship between the particular and the universal? And then finally, I'd like to honor the late, great Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's been a week, friends, it's been a week. 2 quotes. Fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. And perhaps I think most salient to a context of Catholic women, theology, and ethics. She wrote, "Dissents speak to a future age. It's not simply to say, my colleagues are wrong and I would do it this way. But the greatest dissents do become court opinions, and over time their views become the dominant view. So that's the dissenters' hope, that they are writing not for today, but for tomorrow." As an accidental theologian, I've learned an enormous amount from these women, some of whom I've known in close proximity as mentors and friends. Others I have not. And I'd like to close with a quote from Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil by Dr. Emily Towns. "Finally, you must give yourself permission to be fried and tired and weary." Fried, I am. "Besides, you must also find ways of renewal so that you can be a creative and healthy participant in dismantling oppressions." Give yourself permission and find ways of renewal. That is, I suppose, the task. Thanks. It is now my pleasure, and I trust that Kathleen, you will correct me if I'm wrong. It is my great pleasure and good fortune to introduce Dr. Natalia Imperatori-Lee. Natalia Imperatori-Lee is professor of religious studies at Manhattan College in the Bronx, New York, where she also coordinates the Catholic Studies program. She is the author of Quintane, Narrative in the Ecclesial Present, Orbis Books, 2018. Her work has appeared in Theological Studies and the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. She is a fantastic writer. I highly recommend her book, not just for the writing, which is fabulous, but also for the insights therein. In her book, Quintane, of the ways, Dr. Imperatori-Lee reminds us of the ways that feminist method and feminist perception are interwoven. Throughout this work, she reflects, I've referred repeatedly to the sense of the faithful as something overheard in literature, in art, as something contained in dangerous historical memories, as well as in demographic shifts and long-held religious and devotional practices. A Cuban-American native of Miami, Florida, Imperatori-Lee is proudest of her work with the LaSallian Women and Gender Resource Center at Manhattan, where she collaborates with student activists who inspire her every day. In her own words, Dr. Imperatori-Lee describes that she is currently working on a textbook about feminist theology, reading about misogyny, burnout, and entitlement, and therefore probably a rage mom. She lives in the Bronx with her spouse and 2 sons, and to that I would add that she is a fiercely feminist cross-stitcher and defender of the good on Twitter. Indeed, says her longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Maureen O'Connell, Natalia is not afraid to contribute to difficult conversations in her scholarship and thought leadership, in her teaching, in her advocacy for students at Manhattan College, in her support of colleagues in the academy, especially those on the peripheries, and even at the pulpit. That gift comes from a combination of being attuned to experiences of those who get marginalized in our discourse and decisions about who and what matters, as well as her courage to work with others in insisting that other things are possible. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Natalia Imperatori-Lee. Take it away.
Wow, Christiana, thank you so much. That is the nicest introduction I think I've ever gotten. And it's not just because I wrote some of it. So thank you all. It's a real joy to be with all of you. It really is a conversation among colleagues, and I'm enjoying that very much. As Christiana mentioned, I am a Cuban-American feminist theologian who is not an ethicist in any way, shape, or form. I am trained as an ecclesiologist and therefore immersed in a deeply patriarchal institution and trying to love it into becoming something better. To that end, my most recent research and writing has been on feminist theology proper, which leads me to engage a little bit more consistently with secular feminist writers, something that I did not do in graduate school at Catholic Disneyland, Notre Dame, or since really, just under the weight of getting tenure and having children and all the rest. But I have the time and the space to engage that now, and I'm very glad that I do. For many years, for me, the most convincing tagline for feminism that I had came from the activist Marie Scheer, which is just the radical notion that women are people, right? So I actually heard Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza say this at Manhattan one time in her very German accent, which lends it a great deal of credibility and heft. So I thought if the world, if the country, and especially if the church would just recognize that women are full human beings with baptismal dignity, with intellect and will, then the world would be enriched, the church would be just, things would be great. The objectification of women was the problem, and reclaiming baptismal dignity was the solution, right? We're all about human dignity because we're Roman Catholics. A recognition of women as full human beings, that would do the trick. As I engage thinkers like Kate Manne, a philosopher, a feminist philosopher, whose surgical precision when discussing misogyny and its effects is not just to be lauded, but honestly, it should be read by everyone, I really started to rethink the issue of women's humanity. For Manne, Kate Manne, the problem, I'm going to keep saying Kate Manne because otherwise you're going to think I'm saying mankind, which is definitely not what I'm saying. For Kate Manne, the problem isn't that women or non-dominant men or other marginalized persons are objects or subhuman, but rather that one class of person gets to be human beings. And another class, the subjugated class, which is multi-identifiable, are expected and even demanded to be human givers. So from Manne, I'm getting this question bubbling up, right? Again, I'm late to Catholic social teaching, so you'll just have to kind of bear with me, but I'm pretty sure that the human person is the sort of cornerstone of this, and dehumanization is the problem. But once I read Manne, I'm thinking maybe dehumanization is not the primary issue for the church right now. Maybe women's subjugation and that of all non-dominant subjects, right? And here we have to keep in mind coloniality, and we have to keep in mind intersectional analysis. That subjugation stems precisely from their obligation to give uniquely human services and offerings to dominant men. right? It's not that we're not human beings, because what's being asked of us is uniquely human, which is companionship, nurture, gratification, adoration, children, human children. The problem then isn't that we don't see women and people of color and non-males as human beings, but that we see them as human givers. And therefore we characterize them primarily as seres, or persons, who have obligations to others, instead of as being enmeshed in a situation where there are obligations but also entitlements to receive from others. On the surface, this doesn't seem to be a huge problem for Catholic social teaching, because after all, it's about social obligations to others, right? Especially the poor and the vulnerable. But when I think about it, for some people, humanity gets to be expressed as being, right? And existence gets to be expressed as dignity. But for others, in church language, women have a special nature, right? And that special has always hit me in a particular way as not a compliment. And that special nature means that they're uniquely suited to be attentive, loving subordinates to the human beings. We, right, that other class, we are the givers. And now that I've seen this, right, I've put on these glasses, I see it everywhere. So even in Genesis 2 and 3, right, Adam is dissatisfied as long as he has non-human companions, right? Oh yes, the bird is nice, I will name it Bird, and oh yes, yes. But it really isn't until he sees one who is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh that he feels like he has companionship. And in that creation, Eve's fundamental function is that of giver, of helpmate, satisfier for Adam's loneliness, insurance against his future loneliness as the mother of his children. And even some feminist readings of Genesis 2 and 3, right? Is she subverting this in the interaction with the serpent by asking a question? Maybe, but she immediately gives Adam the fruit. So she's giving all of the time. To put it bluntly, I don't think that we can continue to talk about human dignity without addressing the fact that official Catholic teaching about gender complementarity infects even Catholic social teaching and renders some of us beings and others of us givers. And we have to obviously couch this with intersectional caveats and the understanding that for women of color, for example, the giving is compounded. For trans Black women, that giving is even more compounded. That our economies are such that brown and Black hands change diapers in our society far more often, as Kristen Heyer reminds us, than other hands. So what does this distinction between human beings and givers do to Catholic social teaching? At first I thought it just explodes it and we're in deep trouble. But rather than define feminism as the notion that women are people and anchoring Catholic social thought in the notion of human dignity or the dignity of the individual, perhaps it's time that we move the anchor point to a place where we're all fundamentally human givers, not merely the non-dominant among us. This serves as a bit of a challenge to some scripts that run through church teaching. For example, the Vatican insistence that women should be allowed to work outside the home as long as this doesn't interfere with their family duties. But it enhances other notions like human solidarity. It dovetails, I think, with some of the points that Christy was making about dismantling hierarchical understandings of whose voice counts and who gets to be authoritative. In terms of prophetic voices, and I mean, there are a lot here, but along with man, I want to lift up someone like Christine Hinsey, whose work on economies of care really can inform, I think, this community of human givers, right? The human givers idea I actually got from another secular thinker named Emily Nagoski, who wrote a book on burnout that I also can't recommend nearly enough in these days when we're all rapidly careening toward burnout if we're not already there. So if we're going to be a community of givers instead, maybe some of Hinsey's work can help us here. She talks about care work as traditionally feminine coded work and therefore undervalued and underpaid and really erased and made invisible in our society. And when you think about things like the second shift or how women are frequently viewed as automatic nurturers, how men are automatically viewed as heroic for co-parenting and things like this, we really start to see that our messed up gender dichotomies are infecting even our economy. So that now in the age, for instance, of COVID, where those of us who have children who are distance learning in other rooms, or who are, God forbid, like in kindergarten, trying to do Zoom kindergarten or something like that, are constantly torn, and there's no avenue for relief, no avenue for community, no way to overcome the sort of careening train toward burnout that this crucible has presented us with. Kinsey talks about democratizing and broadening participation in care work, and how that can not only start to, like, if once men start participating in care work, the theory is that care work will start to be valued more, right? That men's absence from other kinds of work will show how many hours it takes to feed and clothe and nurture a child, for example, or keep a house clean, or care for an ailing parent, or something like that. So those are the ideas that I'm sort of kicking around as I think about what are we going to do about Catholic social teaching. It's about how intertwined I think our notions of what it means to be, our theological anthropology and our gender theory and our ethics, how intertwined those are, and how when you start to tug on one of these strings, we really start to have to rethink the whole ecology, if you will, of how we think about ethics. It's a scary thing to do, because once we start talking about human dignity with a question mark, we really run into some, I think, scarier places. But ultimately, I think it's crucial that we not shy away from these conversations. As Audre Lorde reminds us, our silence will not protect us, right? Our silence does not bring about the reign of God. And so I look forward to having a productive conversation about these things with all of you. I now want to introduce my dear friend, Kath Punsalan, whom I have known since 1999, I think, or maybe the year 2000, when we journeyed through the hallowed and patriarchal and occasionally racist halls of Notre Dame's PhD program. I remember how wonderful it was to have Kath, another woman of color, in the program, how important it was to see her succeed, and what a joy it has brought, and what a mentor she has been just by being sort of a forerunner for me and a lot of us who came through ND. So here's the introduction that Catherine wrote, but that I'm going to read with feeling. Catherine Punsalan-Manlimos is assistant to the president for mission integration at the University of Detroit Mercy, a role she's had for a little over a year. Prior to Detroit Mercy, she was the inaugural director of the Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture at Seattle University, where she also held the Malcolm and Mary Stamper Chair in the Catholic Intellectual and Cultural Tradition, and was associate professor in theology and religious studies. She was very busy at Seattle. Her articles have appeared in journals in both North America and Asia. She's currently working on a project on women and Catholic social teaching with Kathleen, our moderator, and 5 other women. Her biggest source of joy as an academic is creating interdisciplinary spaces in which teacher, scholar, activists can come together to share the fruits of not only their academic research, but also the richness of their lived experiences as they wrestle with pressing social issues as a community of scholars. Outside of the academy, she's had the privilege of accompanying 2 beautiful children into adulthood with her spouse. So welcome, Kath, and thank you.
Thanks, Natalia. Yeah, 20 plus years. That's amazing to remember and to think about. And thank you for what you've shared as well, because in fact, the ideas that you've shared have really been helping me tremendously in my own reflection. I'm so deeply drawn to the idea of all human beings as being human givers and not just some. Because I think it's really helped me think about something that I've been wrestling with for so very long. as a theologian and just as a human being, as a person, as a woman. And that's the feeling of foreignness, or having felt that there was a foreign way of resisting dominant patriarchal culture that I've found myself experiencing consistently. That what I experienced as a life-giving way of humility, compassion, and care, and that I've understood to be the heart of the gospel and exemplified in the life of Jesus, is somehow I've discovered, especially going into the academy in the United States, is somehow problematic. You know, so many times I've been told to be more fierce, to do a better job of promoting myself and what I'm able to do, to be more aggressive in ways that are not authentic to who I am. Right? Because the way I had learned my faith was that humility, compassion, and care were the marks of discipleship. And while aware that the proddings that I'd gotten from people who were calling me to fierceness, and mind you, I admire fierce women, and that desire was given to me, or they were encouraging me to be fierce because they did not want me to be taken advantage of, I nevertheless often found myself wondering why what I understood to be the way of discipleship is somehow a liability. And this notion of human beings as all being called to human givers, that the problem isn't that there's anything wrong with what I had learned and I had been taught was somehow not problematic, but that all of us were called to this, which in a sense shouldn't be all that radical. That's kind of the teaching of Jesus, at least as I've been taught it, right? Attending to the needs of others, being the last and the least, desiring to be of service to others, you know, seem to me as gospel values, but in fact have become obstacles to the flourishing of so many rather than pathways to their wholeness. And of course, as you were noting, it is no surprise that such is the case, since these gospel values seem to have been heard less as an invitation to the proud, the privileged, and the powerful, and have instead somehow been weaponized and used to keep down those who are already lowly, excluded, and vulnerable. So what I wanted to contribute to this conversation this afternoon may seem like an obvious point, and forgive me for that, but I think it continues to be missing from CST, or offers an optic that, while theoretically supported by CST, appears quite difficult to sustain, namely allowing the lived experiences of women in our great diversity to inform not only the church's understanding of social questions of our time, but what are understood to be the social questions. As I recall from my earliest introductions to the prophets, Professor Epitheli noted that prophets are not people who foretell, and I think Mara said something similar last night. Instead, they're individuals called by God to speak on God's behalf. And over time, I've come to see prophets and understood prophets, as Kathleen was noting earlier, as individuals who know how to read the signs of the times. Right? The context about which they're called to prophesy, and read them in light of God's word, in light of God's love. Prophets are those with the ability to attend to the reality before them and discern God's call within it, to discern the demands of relationship with God and neighbor, and to allow them to offer insights and warnings about the consequences of a community's failure to live up to their end of the covenant. So the genius of the prophet then is to be deeply attuned to the real situation of God's people, the concrete circumstances of their lives, and from there to discern and proclaim the demands of fidelity of the relationship with God, which is of course manifested in our relationship with others. It is this idea of being deeply attuned to reality while being versed with the working of God that I like to think about and reflect on. And especially when it comes to thinking about, to listening to hearing the wisdom, the prodding, the genius that flow from women's experiences. Again, noting the diversity of those experiences. Not some essentialized feminine genius, right? But the genius that comes from diverse lived experiences coupled with discernment that women bring to the church, but is often left unheeded, or at least heeded until the wisdom and the demands that flow from it prove to be inconvenient. So I think what I'm finding myself really thinking through right now and wanting to pay attention to are just three, again, obvious elements that I think we've probably heard through this time we've been spending together since last night. To remember that our lived experience is where we encounter God. And I think we've heard several speakers note this throughout today and yesterday. And that it's here that we can hear God's voice. That women's lived experiences is where women encounter God and where God speaks to them. And so trusting our experiences. But that hearing God's call, this invitation, the prodding, and the challenges requires discernment. Or what Sister Carol spoke about last night, a contemplation, a deep listening, an attending that's cultivated through spiritual practice and silence and solitude. And that a discerning spirit that moves in and through the lives of women can shed light in those places and spaces where wisdom, divine wisdom, is at work, building up. Right? And also shed light on those spaces and places where obstacles are placed in her way. And then to name these. I feel like that's what we're being called to. And I think all these taken together suggest the need to take seriously the theological contribution of women whose works are a product of critical reflection on lived faith in light of God's words, and allow this to inform Catholic social teachings. All too often, women's experiences are articulated by women that are articulated by women aren't considered, or as Natalia, you've suggested in your own writing, right, are considered through the lens of men. Right? Women's voices often get ignored, dismissed, or sidelined in the official construction of Catholic social teachings. And honestly, more tragically, right, because of the points of incongruence between women's lived experience and some of the ideals of CST, some women, many women, learn to distrust their own voices and the inner voice of the Spirit at work within them, within us, within me, right? And I think here, honestly, I'm speaking specifically as a Filipina American, first-generation immigrant, who's consciously and intentionally been reflecting on my own faith experience, right? And as Natalia noted, right, for almost a quarter of a century, and yet I'm still working out who I am and what I have to contribute, because the dominant voices that I've heard over time have made me doubt, right, the movement and the experiences that could be informing what I can contribute. I'm speaking as someone who must constantly remind herself and expend a great deal of energy to believe that what I've come to see and understand through my life's journey, as examined through the lens of faith, is real and contains some wisdom that needs to be spoken and shared. Right? Earlier this morning, we were talking about unmuting our voices, and it takes a lot of energy for those of us who struggle with recognizing our own experiences in the narratives that are constructed around us. I must remind myself to claim and trust the authority inherent in my being a woman of faith, desiring to discern and follow God's will. And I want to share how critical and often difficult it is not to silence myself just because the truth that wants to be spoken through me is contrary to, or at least different from, the dominant lens of my current context. Whether that lens be shaped by classism, patriarchy, white supremacy, sexism, heteronormativity, or the intersection of these. I'm here thinking about the experience of feeling invisible and barely being able to recognize myself in the narratives that I hear about what my life and my struggles are supposed to be about. And as Natalia noted in the introduction, and I'm currently working on a project with Kathleen and 5 other women on the topic of women in CST. And the project was really inspired by an awareness of the missing voices of women in the construction of much of Catholic social teachings, and the inadequacy of the understanding of the situation of women when these are taken into consideration. And so this group of women has been gathering together for over 2 years now, reflecting on social issues that flow out of each one of our lived experience, and we've been bringing these into conversation with the larger Catholic social tradition and with Catholic social thought, with a view to offering a critical and constructive contribution to this tradition, right, while imagining how these reflections might widen and deepen Catholic social teachings. If only the reflections born of the wisdom of these women and their many conversation partners actually inform the Church's understanding of today's social questions. my own contribution to the volume is informed by my experience again as an immigrant and the daughter of immigrants. At first, the project was supposed to be simple, just compare the rhetoric around immigration in public discourse. And then I was thinking there's such better rhetoric and language and descriptions about migrants and immigrants in Catholic social teachings. And so I was going to turn to Catholic social teachings as the place for an alternative to the public discourse. But at some point, because I was journeying with other women and they were helping provide me with a more critical lens, I began to read these documents more closely from the lens of women and from the experiences of women migrants, especially Filipino women migrants, and began to realize that there's a particular image of women contained within these, right? Often women as vulnerable, right? And failing often to acknowledge the agency of women labor migrants, or the broader social questions that flow from the growing feminization of migration and its impact on the church, society, and family. All of this needing further exploration. And again, an anthropology of gender complementarity often becomes an obstacle to challenging gender stereotyping and culturally constructed gender roles that can get in the way of thinking about the flourishing of women migrants, their families, and communities. So I found myself thinking, what would it look like to attend to the realities of migrant women, right? Including attending to the findings and insights of women sociologists, ethicists, theologians, who have been examining these lived realities of not only the women migrants themselves, but the families they leave behind, whether these be parents, children, spouses, or siblings. And to think about these in a careful way, attending particularly to the experience of women. Gemma Tulud Cruz, a Filipina theologian, constructive theologian, has been doing some of this, for example. And she talks about looking at research of women sociologists and theologians alike. She examines, for example, the inability of CST to break out of gender complementarity and a stymied vision of the role of men in the family, a stymied vision reflected in the dynamics of many Filipino households, where fathers and sons are absolved of care work and responsibility for finances of the family, because it's taken for granted that the men cannot be trusted to be responsible for the family in this way. I mean, all of these things give birth to a certain kind of complexity that isn't tackled in Catholic social teachings, that raises social questions, not only for society, but for families. And yet, I wonder if the failure to attend to the reality of women is what leads to the failure to expand even the kinds of social questions that we think are relevant for Catholic social thought, that are worthy of our reflection as a church. So I know, just being aware of time, I just want to say that what I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to reflect on around migration and immigration is part of a larger project. And it is to this project and these women that I'm in this project with that I want to close my reflections. I just want to note that the beauty of this project is that it's not just a group of scholars in their ivory towers found at different institutions in different parts of the country, writing about their independent projects to be collated into volume. It's been intentionally about a community of women coming together, sharing their stories, praying together, breaking bread, lifting one another up, and building community. One of the questions that was asked in the first panel was about Timone's profound insight about not speaking for the voiceless, but inviting, encouraging, and empowering them to find their voice. With that question, I found myself reflecting on the importance of vulnerability that invites vulnerability and trust in another, right? How this is an important element in creating that space that feels safe for the voiceless to practice using their voice. From this community of women, I will say I have felt invited, encouraged, and empowered to do just that. For the scholarship they are doing and for the spaces that they're creating, I will name these women, and I will name them explicitly. Kathleen Maas Weigert, who is our moderator, Erin Brigham of the University of San Francisco, Mary Johnson of Trinity College, Shani Daniel Sykes at Mount Mary, Jeanette Rodriguez at Seattle U, Shannon D. Williams at Villanova. These women are prophets. And in Carol's word from last night, their authentic presence, always building the beloved community and choosing vulnerability. And so I named these women as prophets. And with that, I close my comments and await the thoughts and ideas and comments of this beautiful group of women and all of you.
Wow, wonderful, all three of you, fantastic. Now we get to have a little time for the four of us to think with each other about something we've heard. One of the themes I think underneath each of yours, and the one that's to me so important, is intersectionality. And I'm wondering if each of you might just say something about how you see what you're trying to do. Each of you hinted at it in one way or another, but it is such an important term, and I'm not sure how widely considered people give it. Certainly the church is limited in the hierarchy and thinking, but what do each of you think about that?
I'll take it. Natalia, I'm not sure who you were pointing at because of the order on the screens. Oh, Kathleen, yeah, so important. All right, so there have been what can only be termed as explosive kerfuffles in Catholic moral theology and Catholic social teaching world over the question of intersectionality. And I think the people to read on this are, as there is emerging rigorous work on it, instead of kind of tokenist reductio arguments meant to dismantle a non-existent straw man. The people to read are Emily Reimer-Berry, who's at San Diego, Megan Clark, who's at St. John's in Queens. And I know there are some dissertations, including one at Fordham, that are taking on these questions of intersectionality and Catholic social teaching in really important ways. So intersectionality, of course, is a term that has long been an observation by Black feminists, womanists, and women of color, both living and theorizing at the intersections of racial, gender, and often economic disenfranchisement. But so many scholars trace the lineage of that to a 1990s era article by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about and names intersectionality. And, you know, I think that part of what is so important about intersectionality is it just describes the truth that many people who have demographic realities, Kathleen, you know this as a sociologist better than any of us, who exist in intersecting demographic realities disproportionately bear the burdens associated with each of those in ways that amplify the effects, again, disproportionately. So women of color living in poverty, etc. And what is so utterly infuriating about the way this is often not engaged in Catholic social thought and moral theology is that there is instead a desire to take recourse to a kind of abstract universal human who is unbesieged by these tawdry and unfortunate and inconvenient realities of living and social location. And so that, you know, it reminds me of in our prior conversations as a group in preparation for the seminar when Natalia was talking about Kate Mann's work in her more recent book entitled, and the idea of a notional victim. That so much of, and Natalia, you can riff on this a lot more than I can, but it seems to me to accurately describe what many, not always male, but often male, sometimes celibate, generally white, theorists want to take recourse to is the notion of the dignity of a person in the abstract. And what feminists and womanists and people who value social science and data are talking about is the experience of life in the particulars in ways that are real and describable and which we now have data on. So clearly I have some strong thoughts on this. I will say that a positive aspect I've found in Catholic social teaching about this is that with regard to water, there has been an amplification now through Pope Francis about recognizing that people who live in situations of poverty and people who are also women bear the biggest effects of water scarcity in terms of water gathering, in terms of negative other health incomes and so forth. So, health outcomes, not health incomes. So that is one place I would point to as being more forward thinking than most Catholic social teaching on this.
If I can hop in, yeah, I think intersectionality is something that I talk about a lot in classes now, because it does sort of force us to take into account people's lives as they are lived, which I think is something really powerful, Kath, that you also mentioned. That nobody is living in the abstract. Nobody is living out their human dignity in a sort of bubble. We're all constrained, but also invited into solidarity in different ways. And so on the one hand, intersectionality is about those compounding oppressions, right? That women of color and gay women of color, for instance, bear the oppression of our society that is set up to benefit some and not benefit others in more ways, but also that women of color, like just in my own life, right? That I feel as a Latina that I have solidarity or obligations to my community, my cultural, ethnic, racial community, that at sometimes put me in opposition to or in tension with feminism as it has been traditionally understood. So the intersectional lens is just kind of like putting on 3D glasses at the movie theater, and it allows you to see with a kind of depth how people are actually living and not how we theorize that people are living. And it occurs to me, like, this is what my ecclesiology book was about, was that, you know, too often we talk about the church in these eschatological idealized terms of what the church should or ought to be, without actually looking at what the church really is for people. And I wonder if Catholic social teaching is suffering from this same malaise, where it is talking about human beings as we think they ought to be, which is important in terms of hope, but not really realistic in terms of ethics and maybe the role of bringing women and other non-dominant groups into the conversation of not just elaborating principles for Catholic social teaching, but also diagnosing problems that are worth talking about in Catholic social teaching, is to sort of bring those 3D glasses to that conversation.
We could talk about this forever, I'm quite sure, but there might be another topic that the three of you heard when listening to each other that we might want to talk about, and then open it up to the rest of the audience. So is there some other idea that you'd like us to reflect on?
Can I invite us to reflect on humility? Because Catherine, I'm so resonating with your eloquence. I mean, it's so theologically and philosophically articulate and nuanced, and also such a cry of the heart about one's own self-articulation in contexts that seem to demand certain kinds of performance for recognition. And I have, you know, growing up, I think like probably many women, Catholic or no, the socialization of women tends to be humble. Culturally, there are obviously other layers that get put onto this, and humility was so often understood as self-deprecating, or not taking up air in the room, or being out of the way. And yes, self-abnegation is, I think, the functional outcome. But the idea of humility was not being selfish. And anytime you weren't humble, you were therefore selfish. And I think that, you know, as I've learned more in life experientially and intellectually, I find that when I speak with graduate students who are women, undergraduates who are pursuing different careers, to think about humility not as the opposite of self-promotion or pride, something that requires self-abnegation, as Jessica just wrote in the comments, but rather as an accurate self-description according to the mode most germane and proper to each of us, which sounds like a Thomistic or Aristotelian framing now that I say it that way. But it, you know, the task of accurate self-description is a challenge for people of any sort who have been, of any expression, who have been socialized into a world where description of self is precisely that which is not wanted, welcomed, honored, or affirmed. And so the challenge of humility is also an invitation to courage in certain senses. So I'm pondering these things.
No, and I appreciate that. And part of the struggle, I think, it is precisely that, the notion of how much of this is the way that you've been socialized to disappear, right, and be invisible. And that's, I'm lucky to have a spouse who reminds me that's not what humility is, right? But also, what does it mean, as you were speaking, I think, what does it look like to live with humility and to be a person who is humble in a context where there's certain things that are valued and others are not, right? So that when we're able to speak about who we are in a truthful manner, we can receive how another presents themselves, where that might be radically different, but then we can honor and respect and value that as well, right? That very often there are only certain things that are seen as of value. Right? What is of, and so again, it feels very complex, and you're right, it is a cry. And I think I told you this as we were preparing for this. It's like, I turned 50 this year, and I'm trying to still figure out if I've got anything to say, only because I'm trying to work my way through particular cultural things that are said to be valuable and worth elevating, and other things that aren't, right? And so I'm wrestling with that, with that reality as well. I don't know if it speaks to what you were thinking about, but that's kind of how I'm still wrestling with it.
Yeah, I think when I think about humility, I think of how little room women have to do any sort of self-possession. How close the electric fence of misogyny is to any sort of claim to authority that we might have, no matter how many degrees and how many books and how many whatever. Right, that we're always, I think, because we're classed as givers and not beings, this idea of, any step toward, as you said so beautifully, Christiana, accurate self-description is already sort of hits the buzzer, right? Of, no, look at her drawing attention to herself. Oh, man. And we've been socialized to see that as a real horrible thing, while at the same time being silenced, even if we do things the right way, right? Even if we do things without drawing attention to ourselves. So it's sort of, it's one of the endless list of catch-22s that women have to navigate, and women of color have to navigate. And again, to just keep piling on the demographic descriptors, but we have such a narrow lane. And I think that humility is a real invitation to how to broaden the space that we can be authoritative, such that that we have a certain amount of wiggle room. I don't know if I'm making any sense, so I'm gonna stop talking, but yeah, I just think that we need to broaden our space before we can really sort of enter into that humility.
I love the notion of authority, Natalia. Sorry, just to kind of jump in. Because at the same time, I want to say we need to claim our authority. We need to trust what we know, right? And the wisdom that our life experiences give us. I was looking at some of the things that Sister Carol said last night, talking about, and that image of the stacking dolls, right? And how over time, as one has greater self-possession, that one can be fully present without sucking the air out of the room for everybody else, right? And being able to nevertheless create space. That in fact, it is in being bigger and in creating space and room for others, right? That one can both be humble and yet authentic, right? And fully oneself. But I think this is where, again, the brilliance of last night's keynote was, this comes from contemplation, right? This comes from a deep, profound spirituality, I think. My intuition, when I'm faithful, I know. Right now, I'm just thinking it, right? That gives birth to that where humility is possible while being able to be fully present in a room without taking up all the space. And the things, we don't have a lot of models for that, I don't think, right? We don't have a lot of models for that. It's either you take up all the air in the room, suck it out for everybody else, or you have to stop breathing so that others can have space, right? But again, I think this is where spirituality, spiritual practice, contemplation has an important role to kind of guide us in how that's done.
Again, I think we could talk about this among the four of us for a long time, but I do want to open this up and say, if any of you have a question that you'd like a particular panelist to speak more about, or the panel in general, a topic you'd like them to engage with, please go to the Q&A box that you have and feel free, and I'll try to pay attention, as Megan just sent me a whole bunch of things. Okay, let's see if there's, Juliette Claire Broadnecks. Going back to the Eucharist, a friend's husband is part of an ecumenical charity group working with the poor. They have a prayer service with communion. He wanted to participate, but thought it went against Catholic teachings. He's very much rule-oriented, so saying Christ is in all things would probably not work for him. I feel compassion toward people in this regard. Any suggestions? And by the way, clearly this is the last panel, but some of the other panelists are here from earlier, and please, it should be anyone and everyone who wants to enter into this conversation, because I think that is the whole point of this webinar, is to expand the conversation and the topics within it. So please feel free to speak.
To that question, and I'm going to break in, I would point to the idea of Eucharistic hospitality. The Jesuit Thomas Rausch has been writing on that and researching that. So the question of, can we share Eucharist with each other is something he works on very important ecumenical commissions. So also looking at the work of ecumenical and ecumenists, I think is very helpful.
Terrific. Thank you, Cecilia. Is Timon still here? Because Timon, it seems to me you were partly talking about that with your father as pastor and thinking that you might take over, and you mentioned, just by the way, the Eucharist and what his answer to you. I'm just curious how you went further with that.
Okay, here I am. I'm sorry. What was the question again? I did hear it was Eucharist, but I didn't get the specifics about it.
Well, no, I was thinking about your comment this morning about, or this afternoon, about your father thinking you would become the pastor of his church. And then you said, well, that really doesn't fit because you're Catholic. And he said, well, what's missing? And you said Eucharist. And he said, well, basically, as I understood it, how did you learn about that? You were taught. So where does that leave you with teaching about that to others?
So what that does for me is really open up an understanding of Eucharist. So my understanding of Eucharist then is beyond what we teach. So what we teach in the Catholic faith, after we say that the real presence of Jesus is present in the bread and the wine after consecration, then we limit it only to people who believe. Well, in my understanding then, if Jesus is really present, who are we to limit Jesus' access to anyone, right? I think it's a point where the Catholic Church could burst open the doors and be like, look, the real presence of Jesus is right here in this bread and wine, and you ought to come and check it out because Jesus can transform. So what it does for me is take the holds off of Eucharist and who Jesus is and just the power of God in our lives. Well, that's going beyond church doctrine. That's going beyond what, as you all have been saying in your discussion, what men have said. And it gets to this realm of, can we exist in the full mystery of God and talk about God in our lives in a way that we're not trying to capture the essence of God and put God in a bottle. So can we live in the expanse? So Eucharist for me is just wide open. And it's really, for me, about relationship and how am I with other people.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I think it would be tough for the person that is in the question, feeling not even too sure about anything beyond the rules. So, but that's certainly expansive, Timon, really. Good food for thought.
Sorry, Kathleen. Timon, I love what you have to say, both as someone who loves and in this pandemic moment deeply craves community, and in the sense of why are we trying to limit incarnation here? And you know, I am no sacramental theologian. I'm an accidental theologian and I'm definitely not a sacramental theologian, but I am definitely a sacramental Epicurean feminist. And so what I will say is that in certain circumstances, rules do matter. The Catholic Church and the pandemic and Eucharist, the particularities of Eucharistic availability, I know matter so much to some people with whom I'm very close, and they feel the lack acutely, physically, spiritually, in all the senses. And so I guess, and again, I am not a catechist or a canon lawyer or anything like that, but I would say that the sacramentalist in me would want to reframe the question along the lines of what Timon is saying, and ask the questioner to invite her loved one to think about what is most nourishing in this moment of extremity. You know, it is the case, again, just riffing on this, that baptism can be validly performed by anyone who has water and says, in the names of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In a moment of extremity, which we are most certainly in, could that not be true if someone felt the call of the Spirit in an ecumenical setting? I would argue, yes, of course, which may be why I'm not a professional canon lawyer and theologian. But the point here is to reframe the question to what is nourishing? What do people need for nourishment? And that leads to flourishing, and that can inform, I think, our sacramental reflections, perhaps.
Yeah, if I can just jump in here too, I think what we're circling around again is the ideal versus the real, right? And how often women's lives reveal the reality, right? What doesn't get seen or what happens behind the scenes, the kind of work that it takes to nourish, to keep alive, to foster, order out of chaos and whatever. And so just jumping back toward that conversation, right? When women's voices, and particularly women from non-dominant communities' voices, are invited not only to respond to questions, but to diagnose the problems and ask the questions, that's when you really start to see a reorientation of Catholic social teaching, a reorientation of Eucharistic theology, a reorientation really of all theology, to which women are relative official newcomers, though obviously not newcomers to reflecting critically on faith. So yeah, I think that sort of allowing women to speak from our everyday experience, right, which Latina feminists or Hispanic feminists have called lo cotidiano, right, after Ana Maria Isasi Diaz, the idea of the everyday life, the everyday life as a locus of theology, the everyday life as something that reveals and does not conceal the presence of God is really important.
Sorry, and can I just jump in there also, and just going back to the question, it made me wonder, again, not a sacramental theologian either, so not a canon lawyer, but if the idea is participating in a community coming together to remember Christ and the Last Supper, are we as Catholics limited to doing that only at a Catholic Mass? Right? If we were to choose to break bread together and to remember in a deep way, for example, over our dinner table, are we forbidden from doing that? And I'm imagining a community working together to help others, coming together to share a meal and break a bread and using symbols to do that. I guess I'm a little confused as to why not. I mean, I understand why, well, I don't understand. I mean, I know the theology of why we tend to exclude because of transubstantiation, what others do or don't believe in our worship. But why can't we participate in other ways of remembering the Last Supper and Christ's work in other contexts outside of the Catholic liturgy? I guess I pose that as a question.
And I will just toss in one little personal experience. When I was in Washington, I was at Georgetown for a period of time. There was an intentional Eucharistic community. Now, a lot of people haven't heard of IECs, but it was a gathering in the particular one I belonged to, where we invited a priest. I hope people won't be scandalized, I don't think you will, to celebrate with a lay leader. We did all the work. We raised the money, we did the readings, we did the whole thing. I think that, to me, is one of those ways of trying to think about the original house churches. I'm not a canon lawyer, all the things that you two just said. I'm not a sacramentalist, but I'm someone who's trying to live a faith and in ways that keep expanding my spirit and my vision of what the reign of God really should look like. That was a profound experience for me, to be able to say the words of consecration in what we consider to be a liturgical moment, a Mass. So I'm not sure how others feel, but I appreciate that point, Catherine. How can we think about ways where, to go back to your question, Christiana, your comment about what nourishes us? How do we find the nourishment we need to carry on? So just a thought. And others, please feel free to enter in.
Well, as somebody that works in aesthetics, I would say one of the ways that we discern through things like this, because there are always going to be different questions, is to think if something is really beautiful. Is that moment really beautiful? And if it's really beautiful, then it's probably really good, and it's probably really true. And I think using the beauty and how deeply something moves us as a way to discern, is this going to be something that's good for my community and for me, gives us a way to imagine expansively beyond rules and to engage our hearts. I mean, I love Timon's whole story of the wedding, right? That being in spaces that are deeply beautiful tell us they're good.
If no one else on this particular topic, there is one in the Q&A that asks, could we speak more about complementarity and how it subverts the dignity of humans as a whole? Theology of the body is a huge push among clergy for teaching teens, and complementarity is a major part of that teaching from John Paul II. So who would like to get us started on that conversation?
I will happily get us started on this conversation because I think about this a lot as the mother of a teen and a preteen boy. The gender ideology that is complementarity is profoundly damaging to the people of God because, well, for many reasons. The main ones, to my mind, are that it ties biology and human potentiality in ways that are not clear. In other words, we don't have enough of a handle on biology, human biology surrounding gender and sexuality, to make prescriptive statements about human potentiality going forward, or to make statements about human proclivities or predispositions going forward. Moreover, the language of theology of the body is one where agency, particularly women's agency, is threatened because the notion of consent doesn't exist. Because human sexuality is limited to the licit place, which is the marriage bed, prior to marriage, there cannot be consent because there is no such thing as licit sexuality. And after marriage, there does not need to be consent, because the marriage bed, it is always licit for there to be sexual contact. This is profoundly dangerous for young people, especially, who are navigating a world that is rife with sexual assault, and who are then forced to negotiate not only sexual assault, but silencing and shame. And that is what will damage our children and drive them away from the church: silence and shame about their bodies. So in an effort, and I don't think it's always bad, but I think that the intent to speak to young people about bodies and sexuality is an important one, and it's a good impulse. It's just that all of the language that we are doing is making it so much worse than it needed to be, because it again idealizes human relationships to a point where they cease to be real. And that is true of married relationships, of people before they are married, of people outside of marriage relationships. It's not grounded in any kind of real reality. And so, yeah, I worry a lot about how much the theology of the body is talked about in high schools and in middle schools, Catholic persuasions. And I hope that we can find better ways to talk to our young people about their bodies and about the use of their bodies in sexual ways that is both graced by God and also very much within their agency.
Which just ties into some of the other comments about LGBTQ, about non-binary. I mean, it's so much more complex than dichotomies. One of my favorite expressions is dichotomies deal death. You're either one or the other, and that's the end of it. So how do we help, certainly within CST, the theology of the body writ large, to get some of this in without threatening people who feel like then we're trying to demolish the whole kit and caboodle, which I don't think is the point. But we do look at the signs of the times and we say, what is the world out there? Many of us, I'm sure, have either friends or relatives who are not standard heterosexuals. What are we saying to them? How can we bring them into this conversation to help us? As it was said earlier too, I think Timon said that. Others who would like to?
I would love to augment what Natalia beautifully said. At its most basic anthropological presumption, it is unfortunately a combination, the theology of complementarity, that's complementarity with an EN instead of complement, like a positive accolade, is a binary, so a dualism, as Kathleen is saying, that links a presumption that biology is one's destiny with a heteronormative patriarchal framework that makes that dualism hierarchical. So biology is destiny, hence women who are uniquely suited to bear children. And yes, it is entirely true that female reproductive bodies have different plumbing than male reproductive bodies. And so there are some things that female bodies can do that male bodies cannot, and vice versa. But that does not necessarily need translate. That biological capacity, physiological capacity, need not necessarily translate into broader societal or professional roles or leadership or hierarchies of value and decision making. And so the implications of this biology is destiny logic, when married, pun intended, to a particular interpretation of scriptural ideals and traditional, as in Catholic traditional ideals of marriage, leads to a segmentation of possibilities of living and flourishing that are delimited in a men's roles and women's roles that is deeply problematic and not germane to the fullness of human experience.
I also think that we're living with the hangover of Neoplatonism in the church, and that the female body, as you were talking about, Christiana, was by Plato famously, right, considered to just exist for reproduction, and Augustine thought we were, you know, deficient males, etc. The body itself was denigrated, and the mind was the only thing that mattered. And so we also have to read this other dualism into all of these constructions. Is the body is bad. El cuerpo asno, you know, that you need to subdue your body. The mind is great. That's the maleness, right? And the femaleness is the body. So I would say we also have to just continually push back against everything that smacks of this kind of mind-body dualism, and reclaim the beauty and power of the human body, which I hope, you know, by thinking of the image that we had this morning, we will reclaim.
Yeah, and just to, like, one last thing, you can see how that dichotomizing then feeds into women are natural givers. Women are human givers. They are meant to nurture because they have uteruses, not all of which are fertile, but nevertheless, right, because they have this biology, it means that they are spiritually, socially, and psychologically givers. I don't know how we push back, Jessica. I'm going to mute myself now before I have to answer that question.
And I wonder if we think about the harm also to the male.
I blame Aristotle and Augustine. Those are my two.
Yes,
Catherine,
I can hear that. Plato, the Neoplatonists, Aristotle, and Augustine. But I also blame white privilege, male comfort, and those who benefit from that system, female, male, everything in between and beyond, who are unwilling to question the benefits that privilege provides and assume that it's universalizable. So the ways in which, you know, there are so many examples of this in contemporary society. And I think it's important that it's not just the forebears or even the patriarchy, formally as the Vatican, but also those who benefit and are committed to, tacitly or explicitly, a particular way of living as bodies in a world that somehow relies on excluding other people from that participation. You know, so many of us on this panel and today, we couldn't have been professors in theology departments 50 years ago, you know? I mean, it's recent and it's enduring, and it's a presumption of the status quo.
Jessica asked a question though, how do we push back if we're not theologians and scholars? And I'm of a mindset that the pushback comes because you have found your voice, because or someone has helped you find your voice. And it's not about being a theologian, and it's not about being a scholar, but it's about being a person, and a person who has tapped into their prophetic witness and speak, right? And they speak this truth to power in spite of what other people are saying around them, in spite of not being popular. As I think about the early church was not popular, right? And there was still people speaking about what they believe. So I am not convinced that the only people who get to push back are theologians and scholars. If that was the case, we would really be in trouble, because many
huge trouble. And I wish.
I mean, because come on, a lot of us are where? In a book, right? We're doing some research. We're not necessarily on the ground. So I think it's this relationship between scholars and people on the ground, people who are living, reminding us of what it means to not live in our books and not live inside of research, but to be with people and be attentive to what people are saying and struggling and witnessing and experiencing. And so the how is really about being attentive to the relationships that we're entering into, as Cecilia said earlier, this work of building bridges, right? To be attentive to other people, and how can we come together in ways that make us vulnerable, right? And I think
Absolutely. And that whole idea, I think you said it, and so many, we have to do this in community. We are our supporters for each other as we're trying to percolate ideas, share them, and stand up with our voice and listening to the voices of others. I do wish we had more time, but I know that Mike is ready to thank us all. I just want to add my personal thanks for the invitation and to being with all of you. It's been quite inspiring. Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Kathleen. And gosh, I guess we're scheduled to end, and I feel like we just started. So let me say a couple of things and we'll close. It's my role and it's my honor really as director to close the proceedings. So I just want to let you know that videos will be available really soon, maybe even tonight. I think we had the YouTube one that just comes right up. A rough draft, but it'll just have the straight recording. We don't do much editing. We do zero really. But then we have a webinar video coming, and but maybe even tonight, check around our Hank Center YouTube channel and you can find it. What else? Our webpage also has info for our fall programming, and everything's on Zoom, and there's a lot of good things that are coming from Zoom. But I just want to point you to two things next week. We're collaborating with several co-sponsors on an exciting and important series, Racial Justice and Healthcare. Many co-sponsors, and it really came from our medical school that are White Coats for Black Lives Matter, and initiative by medical students. So we're excited about that. That's on Tuesday. And then on Thursday, it's another Zoom forum, 90 minutes, 4 o'clock Central. Jerome Baggett from GTU and Santa Clara and in Berkeley. You know what I mean. And then Paul Lakeland from Fairfield and Kaya Oaks. Kaya Oaks was on the call today, was on our Zoom webinar. We'll be discussing secularization and faith. We'll be dialoguing about that. So please check our page and join us for those things. Really a massive, massive hearty thanks to all of our speakers and our conveners. You can see people discussed in advance what they wanted to do. And I just want to thank you for your time and expertise and for your goodwill to do that. So many rich conversations. I learned a lot, and I know from the chat, so many others did as well. So I think this really has far reaching impact on so many people. So thank you very much, everybody. Give you a round of applause there. And then finally, our staff, our dedicated and intrepid staff, Megan, Toomey, Kathleen McNutt, our two undergraduate assistants, Catherine and Francis. I have to have a last word, but the last word always goes to the poet. So in this case, it's Ada Limon, who's a fellow Californian, and she's a wonderful poet. And here's one from her from about 2 years ago, 2018. And it's called How to Triumph Like a Girl by Ada Limon. I like lady horses best, how they make it all look easy, like running 40 miles per hour is as fun as taking a nap or grass. I like their lady horse swagger after winning. Ears up, girls, ears up. But mainly, let's be honest, I like that they're ladies, as if this big, dangerous animal is also a part of me, that somewhere inside the delicate skin of my body, there pumps an 8-pound female horse heart, giant with power, heavy with blood, Don't you want to believe it? Don't you want to lift my shirt and see the huge beating genius machine that thinks? No, it knows. It's going to come in first. Thank you, one and all. I think it's time to go for a walk. God bless you.
Thanks, Mike. Bye, all.
Hi, all.
Thank you.
And
Thank
to that,
you.
may I just add one line from Ruth Bader Ginsburg on being a lady. My mother told me to be a lady, and for her, that meant be your own person, be independent. Thank you all.
Yeah, amen.